At the dawn of the 20th century, if you were to wander through London's Gordon Square on a sunny afternoon, there was a distinct possibility that you would happen upon a member of the Bloomsbury set, a small clique of artists and writers whose lives would have lasting impact on the development of social and cultural life in the Western world. It was never an official club, but was instead built on the shared social life and intellectual leanings of the group's core members, comprising Clive and Vanessa Bell, E.M. Forster, Roger Fry, Duncan Grant, John Maynard Keynes, Desmond McCarthy, Lytton Strachey, and Leonard and Virginia Woolf. These individuals were united by an admiration of the philosophy of G.E. Moore, particularly the conception of intrinsic worth as distinct from instrumental value, which the Bloomsburys interpreted as a justification to place themselves at the centre of the moral universe, without regard for the consequences of their actions. They placed the highest importance on interpersonal relationships, as well as art for art's sake. This was a firm rejection of the values of the Victorian bourgeois, who they held in disdain as camera-totting fact addicts. The 1920s was the peak of Bloomsbury influence. E.M. Forster published A Passage to India, while Desmond McCarthy and Leonard Woolf edited The New Statesman and The Nation. But as the Roaring Twenties faded into memory, the fortunes of the Bloomsbury set soured with it. Lytton Strachey died in 1932, Dora Carrington shot herself, Roger Fry died in 1934, and Virginia Woolf drowned herself in 1941. In the midst of the Second World War, Bloomsbury appeared nothing more than a passing fad. But the Bloomsbury set weren't the only ones inspired by the philosophy of G.E. Moore. At Cambridge University, work was underway to provide the foundations for analytical philosophy. Since the time of Descartes, Western philosophy has searched for a solid foundation of truth from which to build. The early 20th century was a golden age for analytical philosophy, as Whitehead, Russell, and Wittgenstein produced seminal works in Principia Mathematica and Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. However, the attempt to ground mathematics in logic failed, and the conclusions of Tractatus seemed to negate the endeavour of philosophy altogether. In Europe, the logical positivists were exploring similar themes, attempting to find a foundation for truth through direct empirical observation and a priori logical deduction, the logical conclusion of which was a rejection of Immanuel Kant's synthetic a priori truth and a return to David Hume's fork of either analytic a priori or synthetic a posteriori truths. The Vienna Circle was disrupted by World War II, but it was Karl Popper's The Logic of Scientific Discovery, originally released in 1934 but not translated into English until 1959, that caused the implosion of the logical positivist movement. Popper, along with Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, would form the origins of the philosophy of science. This created an opportunity for an alternative philosophical approach to fill the void. In Weimar, Germany, the Frankfurt School, building on the ideas of Hegel, Marx, and Freud, developed critical theory to challenge power structures in order to bring about social change. With the onset of World War II, most of the Frankfurt School would be forced to flee Germany, with many settling in America, including Walter Adorno and Herbert Marcuse. Adorno worked in radio during his time in the States, but is probably best known for his work, The Authoritarian Personality, released in 1950. The F-scale, as it was known, was a questionnaire that, according to Adorno, could recognize which individuals were susceptible to fascist propaganda. Over time, the F-scale was discovered to be deeply flawed. Failure to reverse code questions means the test is highly subject to acquiescence bias. Psychologist Hans Eysenck concluded that what the F-scale was actually measuring was a trait known as tough-mindedness, rather than an individual's propensity towards fascism. Herbert Marcuse remained in America in the post-war period, teaching at Columbia, Harvard, and the University of San Diego. Marcuse was highly influential on the New Left movement that was emerging in the West, partly as a reaction to the Soviets sending tanks into Budapest, alienating the last Western left-wingers loyal to the USSR. The New Left was defined by its focus on social issues such as feminism, civil rights, and gay rights, replacing the traditional prominent theme of the left, class struggle. In 1965, Marcuse co-authored A Critique of Pure Tolerance, an attempt to justify not only the suppression of right-wing thought, to combat what he considered the indoctrination of the US public school system, but also the justification of left-wing violence. Even in the advanced centers of civilization, violence prevails. It is practiced by the police, in the prisons, and the mental institutions. In terms of historical function, there is a difference between revolutionary and reactionary violence, between violence practiced by the oppressed and by the oppressors. Written a year before the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, Marcuse's historical analysis rests on the assumption that the Chinese Revolution was one of progress, a highly debatable conclusion, and it seems Marcuse has an almost militant commitment to pacifism until the violence is committed by his political allies. His anti-police sentiment and his belief in the natural right of the oppressed minorities to use extra-legal means, along with his chastising of any establishment intellectual who criticized them, is today painfully familiar. Some intellectuals stayed behind in Germany, most notably Martin Heidegger. His introduction of the idea of Dasein, or being, represented a fundamental departure from the rationalist subject-object approach of Western philosophy since the time of René Descartes. The concept of Dasein is difficult to pin down. Dasein is not man, but is nothing other than man. The ordinary and mundane experience of being in the world provides an access to meaning or sense of being that is essentially pre-scientific, in that it precedes abstract ways of knowing, such as logic and theory. The concept of being is heavily linked to time. An individual is essentially thrown into a state of being in a world that implies inherent pastness to its being. This being is an inseparable subject-object, which cannot be detached from its objective historicality. Stretched between birth and death, thrown into a world of possibilities which it is in charge of assuming. A being's access to this world will always be via a history and a tradition. This is the question of world historicality. Here, Heidegger lays down much of the foundations for continental philosophy. Another intellectual who remained in Germany was Carl Schmitt. Schmitt was highly critical of the flaws he saw in the liberal democracy of the Weimar Republic. Schmitt argued in favor of the essence of dictatorship, as this is the only effective way power can be wielded opposed to the endlessly time-consuming process of parliamentary politics and bureaucracy. If the constitution of a state is democratic, then every exceptional negation of democratic principles, every exercise of state power independent of the approval of the majority, can be called dictatorship. For Schmitt, every government capable of decisive action must include a dictatorial element within its constitution. It follows that whoever has power to decide what constitutes a state of emergency ultimately holds power in society. He who is sovereign makes the exception. Schmitt is a controversial figure who eagerly participated in the burning of books and resisted all attempts at denazification, effectively prohibiting him from working within post-war academia. Still, Schmitt's ideas are recognized to have influenced a number of continental philosophers, including Walter Benjamin, Jürgen Habermas, and Jacques Derrida. The 1960s saw a rapid intensification of political and cultural change, an explosion of underlying trends that had been building in post-war Western civilization. It also saw a beginning in the decline in standards in Western higher education, embodied by University of California professor Timothy Leary.
Drop out of school, because schools, education today, is the worst narcotic drug of all. Don't politic, don't vote. These are old men's games, impotent and senile old men that want to put you onto their old chess games of war and power. Drop out. Tune in with natural things. Take off your shoes. Get back in tune with God's harmony. Surround yourself with beauty and sacred objects. You can't get caught in the conforming, rote lockstep, which we call American society.
It was in this atmosphere that Michel Foucault published Madness and Civilization. His analysis of the historical development of society's response to insanity, which would have a lasting impact on the way mental illness was treated, particularly in California. In this 1971 debate between Foucault and Chomsky, we can see evidence of the analytical versus continental divide within the confines of radical left thinkers.
De toute façon, la notion même de justice fonctionne à l'intérieur de la société de classe comme revendication du côté de la classe opprimée et comme justification du côté de la classe opprimée.
I don't agree with that.
Et dans une société sans classe, je ne suis pas sûr qu'on ait encore à utiliser cette notion de justice.
Yeah. Well, here I really disagree. I think that there is a sort of an absolute basis. If you press me too hard, I'll be in trouble because I can't sketch it out. But some sort of an absolute basis ultimately residing in fundamental human qualities, in terms of which a real notion of justice is grounded. And I think that our existing systems of justice I think it's too hasty to characterize our existing systems of justice as merely systems of class oppression. I don't think that they are that. I think that they embody systems of class oppression, and they embody elements of other kinds of oppression. But they also embody a kind of a groping towards the true humanly valuable concept of justice and decency and love and kindness and sympathy and so on, which I think are real.
Je dirais simplement ceci. Je ne peux pas m'empêcher, contrairement à ce que vous pensez, je ne peux pas m'empêcher de croire que cette notion de nature humaine, cette notion de bonté, de justice, d'essence humaine, de réalisation de l'essence humaine, tout ça, ce sont des notions et des concepts qui ont été formés à l'intérieur de notre civilisation, dans notre type de savoir, dans notre forme de philosophie, et que par conséquent, ça fait partie même de notre système de classe, et qu'on ne peut pas, aussi regrettable que ce soit, on ne peut pas faire valoir ces notions pour décrire ou justifier un combat qui doit en principe bouleverser les fondements mêmes de notre société. Il y a là une extrapolation.
We can see that Foucault is unequivocal about his belief that the very foundations of Western civilization needed to be overthrown. Although he would come to reject the label, Foucault's thought was influenced by structuralism, the concept that binary oppositions constitute structures that underpin all our institutions and social relations. Other left-wing thinkers also began to abandon the structuralist approach, most notably Jacques Derrida, who promoted the idea of deconstruction as a method to move beyond the binary oppositions, which he argued were unacknowledged assumptions of the Western tradition.
When you deconstruct, and I'll try to explain what I mean by that, when you deconstruct anything, you simply do not destroy or dissolve or cancel the legitimacy of what you're deconstructing. In that case, deconstructing the subject, if there is such a thing, would mean first to analyze historically in a genealogical way, the formation and the different layers which have built, so to speak, a concept. Every concept has its own history, and the concept of subject has a very, very long, heavy, and complex history. First, for instance, in the English tradition, philosophical tradition, the word subject is not used the same way, or sometimes it's not used as a canonical concept, the way it is used in continental philosophy, in German philosophy, in French philosophy. So first we have to translate these words into first a different idiom, and finally in all the possible idioms. Since we're supposed to address here the problem of human rights, we face first the problem of language. If there are human rights, which means universally valid human rights, they should be accessible, understandable to everyone, whatever language they understand or they speak. Now, if you try to make the word subject understandable in a culture in which the philosophical Greek, German, Latin tradition is not familiar, then the word doesn't mean anything. So the first thing you have to do is a universal translation of what the subject is. So deconstruction of the subject is first, among other things, the genealogical analysis of the trajectory through which the concept has been built, used, legitimized, and so on and so forth.
But Derrida's ideas were not without controversy. In 1992, a group of academics at Cambridge University proposed that Derrida should be awarded an honorary degree. This move was strongly opposed by other academics who were highly skeptical about the quality of Derrida's philosophy. The debate over whether Derrida should be awarded an honorary degree was settled by a vote among the faculty that favoured him by 336 to 204, although it is worth noting that almost no one from the Cambridge Philosophy Department voted in favour of Derrida, and they were among his harshest critics. In 1985, Roger Scruton released Thinkers of the New Left, scrutinising the ideas of 13 popular thinkers associated with the New Left, including Michel Foucault. The book provoked derision and outrage from the left-wing establishment, and many of the nowadays common tactics of what is currently referred to as cancel culture were employed against Scruton. It effectively ended his teaching career, and there were calls to boycott the publisher, Longman, for having the audacity to print such a work. Scruton is scathing of the claims made by Foucault in Madness and Civilization, pointing out the inherent contradiction in the work's central theme. The province of language and the province of reason are coextensive. And if madness contained its own truths, as Foucault claims, these are essentially inexpressible. How can we rightly imagine a language of unreason in which the truths of madness are expressed, and to which we must now attune our ears? The idea of such a language is the idea of the delirious monologue, which neither the man of reason nor the madman himself can understand. The voice of madness belongs to no one, since it violates the grammar of the self. Scruton also demonstrates how Foucault's attack on the values of the bourgeois family is founded on a confused analysis of history. All this is based on an elaborate and, to tell the truth, culpable simplification of historical data, the prime aim of which is not truth, but propaganda. Foucault's rhetoric is supposed to mesmerize us into some sense of intrinsic connection between bourgeois, family, paternalistic, and authoritarian. Historical facts, such as the peasant family being more authoritarian, the aristocratic family more paternalistic than the family known as bourgeois, or that the middle class shows an ability to relax the temper of domestic life which has seldom been matched at the upper and lower ends of the spectrum. All such facts are kept out of mind. Scruton also made prescient insights into Foucault's theory of justice and the abolition of the judiciary. But what does this mean in practice? It means there shall be no third party present at the trial of the accused, no one with responsibility to sift through evidence, no one to mediate between the parties. It means the criminality of the act will become as unpredictable as the penalty it incurs, for no law could exist that could determine the outcome. It means that all justice will be reduced to a struggle between opposing factions, a trial by ordeal in which, presumably, he who speaks with the voice of the proletariat will take the prize. Further doubts on the academic rigor of postmodern scholarship were raised in 1996, when Social Text, a cultural studies journal, published Alan Sokal's parody essay, Transgressing the Boundaries, towards a transformative hermeneutics of quantum gravity. The main claim of the essay was that it has become increasingly apparent that physical reality, no less than social reality, is at bottom a social and linguistic construct. The paper is full of absurdities, statements that would be obviously incorrect to anyone with even a layman's knowledge of science and technology, combined with blatant appeals to left-wing political ideals and assumptions. Fortunately, postmodern science doesn't have to follow old-fashioned rules of linear Aristotelian logic, such as non-contradiction. Sokal described his article as a melange of truths, half-truths, quarter-truths, falsehoods, non-sequiturs, and syntactically correct sentences that have no meaning whatsoever. I also employed some other strategies that are well established in the genre: appeals to authority in lieu of logic, speculative theories passed off as established science, strange and even absurd analogies, rhetoric that sounds good but whose meaning is ambiguous, and confusion between the technical and everyday uses of English words. By the second decade of the 21st century, it had become glaringly obvious that something had gone horrifically wrong in Western academia. It was in this period that the social justice warrior, those who are now more commonly referred to as woke, became a prominent part of the political landscape. In 2018, Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt published The Coddling of the American Mind, documenting the mindset that had become entrenched in American universities. They discovered that 3 false assumptions were at the foundation of attitudes prevalent throughout the education system. The assumption that human beings were mentally fragile rather than anti-fragile, the mistaken belief in emotional reasoning, and the dividing of the world into 2 camps of good and bad people. The riot at the Milo Yiannopoulos event at UC Berkeley was one of many violent incidents that occurred on US campuses during the 2010s, but was undoubtedly the most symbolic, as students protested against free speech in the same place where only half a century ago they had stood for it. Investigating the disturbance, Haidt and Lukianoff found that both Berkeley students and faculty had been involved. It is impossible to know how many Berkeley students took part, because the university never launched an investigation into the riots to determine precisely who the Black Bloc protesters were. One UC Berkeley employee bragged on social media about beating an attendee of the event, even posting a photo of his unconscious body on the ground, and several UC Berkeley students admitted they participated. Haidt and Lukianoff drew comparisons between the atmosphere on campuses in that period as similar to the Chinese Cultural Revolution. These events fitted the pattern presented by sociologist Albert Bergson when he analysed the Cultural Revolution through the lens of Emile Durkheim. There were 4 distinct similarities that occurred during these 2 eras of political witch hunts. They arise quickly, they appear out of nowhere, and are not a feature of regular social life. Suddenly the community finds itself infested with all sorts of subversive elements that pose a threat. Crimes against the collective. The various charges that appear are mainly concerned about crimes against the community as a whole. These charges are often trivial or fabricated, and a general fear of defending the accused. Public and private opinions on accused individuals are often contradictory. Perhaps it should have been obvious from the beginning that the foot soldiers of wokeness were clearly not a movement of intellectuals motivated by high-minded ideals. Wokeness appears to be a subconscious attitude rather than a rationalized ideology in many of its adherents. Woke people have a tendency to exist in social cliques of artists, each of them their own pale imitation of the Bloomsbury set. We know that certain types of art can be described as woke, but what intrinsic property does this art possess that causes us to inherently link the object with the concept? To me, wokeness appears to be a Frankenstein monster, born out of a primordial soup of dubious continental philosophy and discredited left-wing political ideas. Intellectual arguments are continuously simplified as they spread down to the masses, often interpreted in ways their progenitors neither foresaw nor would approve of. But certain elements have clear similarities with the continental thinkers. Adorno's obsession with hidden fascism, Marcuse's intolerance of opposing opinion, Foucault's desire to subvert all Western civilization, all are on clear display in the modern political left. Possibly through a pipeline of contagion from the universities, the financial elite have now co-opted this ideology as a justification for their increasing global hegemony, a decision that could yet prove to be their undoing. Complex and wide-ranging questions, such as what caused the rise of wokeness, rarely receive definitive answers, and no doubt the subject will be hotly debated for some time. It is a similar question to what caused the rise of the mid-20th century Germans, where a plethora of root causes can be given. From a variant of communism to the inevitable result of certain pieces of legislation, there will be many competing explanations for the curse of wokeness. But don't ever let the left gaslight you into thinking it was never a thing. But perhaps the most important thing right now is that wokeness certainly appears to be bleeding. And if it bleeds, we can kill it.
Got on the train from Cambridgeshire, moved down to an East London flat. Got a moustache and a low-cut vest, some purple leggings and a sailor tat. Just one gear on my fix-it bike, got a +1 here for my gig tonight. I play safe, we all play safe. 20/20 vision, just a pair of empty frames. Dressing like a nerd, although I never got the grades. I remember when the kids at school would call me names. Now we're taking over their estates. Well, I love my life as a dickhead. All my friends are dickheads too. Come with me, let's be dickheads. Being a dickhead's cool. Being a dickhead's cool. Being a dickhead's cool. Being a dickhead's cool, cool, cool. Polaroid app on my iPhone, taking pictures on London fields. Up on the blog so everyone knows we're having new age fun with a vintage feel. Coolest kids at a warehouse rave. Exclusive list, look, there's my name. I got in, you couldn't get in. Never bought a pack of facts, I only roll my own. Plugging in my laptop at the Starbucks down the road. Say I work in media, I'm really on the dole. I'm the coolest guy you'll ever know. Whoa, I love my life as a dickhead. All my friends are dickheads too. Come with me, let's be dickheads. Being a dickhead's cool. Oh, being a dickhead's cool. Being a dickhead's cool. Being a dickhead's cool, cool, cool.
Loafers with no socks. Electro-pop meets southern hip-hop. Indeterminate sexual preference. Something retro.